Welcome, Miko. So lovely to see you again. And thank you so much for offering to contribute to this panel. I was absolutely fascinated initially to hear that Zuckerberg was actually going to create his own coin. And I'm also interested because really his history has been more to do with gaining more power. And so that's why I called this panel centralisation rather than decentralisation, because I figured that must have been the motive. I don't know whether that turned people off from wanting to contribute, but thank you for your courage and willingness to contribute. I was wondering if you could tell me what your perspective is on this and what you think Zuckerberg's up to.
Yeah, so, I think it really, really, really makes sense for Facebook, right? And what I mean to say by this is that we've reached a period of economic history which I think of as the peak of what I call the attention extraction economy. Right? So what we've reached, so for example, if you look at Facebook and you look at what they've been able to do, what they've been able to do is really drive essentially the economy, right? I mean, when you're really looking at what's happening, right? What's happened is that we have a handful of companies that are trillion-dollar companies, right? In the range of like 800 billion or, better part of a trillion, right? And it's really techs, right? It's Apple. And obviously we have certain companies like, Saudi Aramco that's potentially much larger and based on a completely previous economic base, which is, petroleum and kind of not attention extraction, but really mineral extraction, right? And fossil fuels. And, so that's the predecessor. Yeah. But to me, the thing that's really clear is what we've had exponential technologies and exponential growth. And this is the case of Facebook. And that essentially what they've done is they've set price targets for Facebook stock, right? So Facebook stock is essentially a coin in the sense that what happens is that Facebook stock has it's a stable coin. Now, I'm being amusing because it's not stable against the US dollar. It's actually gone up, right? The thing that's interesting about it is that it is pegged to the target value of Facebook. So every quarter, Facebook is saying, hey, our target value is X. And they're basically increasing the target value based on what? What they're basing it on is they're basing it on exponential user acquisition. But the thing that's really interesting is that they're unable to really further move the goalpost because you can either get a higher average revenue per user, right? Or you can get more exponential user growth. But the thing that's really interesting is with depending on how you count, 2.3 billion monthly actives, maybe 2.7 kind of registered users, like it's hard without finding other populated planets to like double, this count, right? So we're reaching kind of the limit of exponentially increasing the user count, right? And so then the question becomes, how can you continue, right? So what you really have to consider then is you have to consider how do you exponentially increase sort of the average revenue per user, and clearly the answer can't be better ad targeting, right? So they're almost tapped out on the limits of what they're able to do, both with invading people's privacy as well as increasing the AI algorithms that target, right? So really what we're seeing kind of a really the end of the road, right? So to me, when I think about Libra, I really think about the conversion towards a novel revenue stream. And you could interpret what Zuck said at F8. He said basically, we're going to build a Facebook that respects your privacy. There's only two ways to interpret that, right? One of them, there's shades where you could think, well, he's kidding himself, right? And that's kind of a gray area. But like he's either really kind of bold, it's either a bold-faced lie, right? Yes. But I actually don't think so. I think that he's actually planning to rebuild the nucleus and to wean Facebook away from ad revenue, right? Because a Facebook where the dominant form of revenue is financial services is one in which they don't actually need to invade your privacy in order to continue to grow, which is really the ambition.
Okay. That really makes sense, and it's also a much more positive version of why he's creating.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that's very interesting is that What is an enabling technology very clearly is open source financial infrastructure, particularly the ones based on consensus and novel distributed consensus algorithms, namely quote unquote blockchains, and so obviously there's quite a lot of inspiration coming from that direction.
So I've always had a hate for the whole interruption advertising model, and I've never ever had any advertising on my YouTube channels or anything like that, which I could have been making money on, mainly because I just hate it. And I always felt like it's such an old model, and to watch all the newspapers or online mags now blocking people if they have ad blockers, which I've got a ton of ad blockers, and saying, you've either got to take our ads or we're not going to show you our stuff. Even the New York Times, you can't even tweet a headline because they block it.
That's right.
And you go, why would they be doing that?
And people are unable to share the content. Yeah, absolutely.
So why are they stuck in the dark ages? And so what you're saying makes me think, so maybe, because I really haven't invented or discovered or heard of anyone having an alternative revenue model, but maybe the tokens are the way to go.
Yeah, I think what we've realized is we've reached a limit, right? And the thing that's fascinating that now you're kind of bringing it into Google and you're bringing it into YouTube and you're bringing it into these other realms, because when you look at all these superpowers, right, the premise is really that we've built an entire internet that's essentially powered by advertising, right? And the thing that's really intriguing is that that's really the almost, I would say, the end of the road, right? In the sense that we're really looking to reset the infrastructure and rebuild. So, one of the really great ways to dip your head into, one future scenario is something like the Brave browser, right? So it's a fascinating, social experiment. Yeah. One of the things that's amazing about it is that the value proposition is really expressible without using any crypto anything, right? So you can really go to someone on the street and you can say, faster browser with no ads, right? And, there's no Bitcoins in there, there's no blockchains in there. People can listen and say, well, I know what a browser is and faster and no ads sounds good, so I'll try it, or I won't try it, right? I don't want that. But people know what it is, they know what the value is, and they can say yes or no, which I think is very nice. Yeah. The thing that I think is kind of subversive about it is if we think about the economy today, and by the way, when I say economy, it's inseparable from also politics, as the politics of attention and extraction, right? The thing that's really interesting becomes, what if you enter into a scenario like in the Brave browser, where essentially you're sort of rebuilding the primitives atop which we've built, essentially the internet, right? So the primitives that are very interesting now are, well, now they have concepts like tipping, right? Where you can sail by. In fact, the default browser mode is actually this auto tipping mode, right? Where basically you browse the internet and you're basically sprinkling economic fairy dust on every web page that you visit, right? Which is astonishing, right? Yeah. So in a way, the thing that's astonishing about it is when you actually think about the biosphere of the internet, right? In a sense, what's happened is it's currently powered by this dark energy, which is an energy of essentially, invading privacy and taking people's attention and using their attention, essentially effectively without their consent, right? Whereas the thing that's really interesting about the reversal would be to rebuild the internet under a different paradigm, right? And so the thing that's fascinating to me about these metaphors is I come from maybe 25 years or so in Silicon Valley open source software. Right. And the open source software movement to me is like this amazing ecosystem because the energy of it is fueled essentially by consent. Right. And so in a way, it mirrors sort of the biosphere in the way that this energy reverses entropy. So instead of the tragedy of the commons, you actually get this huge explosion of value in the commons, right? Now, according to the current way of measuring that value, it's actually not a positive value because you're actually commoditizing commercial software and you're making it free, right? So in a way, it's actually adverse to the GDP. But if you actually just think about it more holistically, you'll realize that that's an astonishing corner of the internet, and that corner of the internet that produces software is actually really kind of the beating heart of what's happening with respect to the transformation of financial infrastructure. So, obviously Facebook, people argue that it isn't open source financial infrastructure, but in fact it is, right? Like according to the rule of open source, yes, they're traveling under a well-known open source license, and the code is open and readable, and it is reposited in a public addressable form. So in fact, yes, Libra is open source financial infrastructure.
And how do you feel about the fact that most of the world powers are up in arms about Zuckerberg having this power of having his own currency?
Yeah, it's amazing, right? And it's funny when you say it that way, right? Because when you're saying well, Zuckerberg has his currency, I'm just picturing a literal physical coin with his face on it. It's very amusing, right? But in a way, in the style of a Roman emperor, like a Caligula or some crazy emperor, right? But it kind of isn't so, in the sense that the Libra organization, presently 28, in the future 100 plus organizations, collected together, under a Swiss foundation. So, it is in a way, Facebook is using open source. Right. And the thing that's fascinating about the way it's using open source is it's kind of using it in the way of an underdog, right? Because the thing that's fascinating is that open source is really the tool of underdogs, because in a way, it's always, the proprietary approach has always been to sort of just hang on to your intellectual property and kind of exploit it, right? So if you're a monopolizer, generally you're closed, and if you're if you're part of the Rebel Alliance, then you're probably more open. So that's so it's strange to see Facebook kind of behaving in this way.
Yeah, and I guess that's why we can't really work out how it's all going to turn out or what his real motives are, right?
Yes, I think it is hard to evaluate his motives. The thing that's amazing is obviously he has supernumerary shares, but what's been is extraordinary is watching the evolution of that style of corporate governance in the context of something like Alphabet/Google, right? Because even in the context of having sort of supreme voting control without controlling a majority of shareholding stock, the board of Google still elected to do things like eliminate the concept of don't be evil, which is, I think, a very interesting pattern, right? So the thing that's interesting about the case of Mark Zuckerberg is that he is, and he continues to be, a founder CEO, and he continues to have this kind of supernumerary voting power, right? So he's really, really instrumental, and in a sense, the thing that's fascinating is that what remains unknown is kind of how this plays out, right? So that's where I think all the fascination is, because we're really experimenting with financial infrastructure of the world.
Right. Well, it's going to be a fascinating panel, and I really appreciate you coming and contributing. Thanks so much, Miko.
Absolutely. Should be fun.